Good morning, everyone. My name is Jean, and I'm an alcoholic. And it's really an honor to be here. And I want to thank Matt. I mean, what a great opening. There is so much the spiritual parallels, the pure spiritual lessons I can learn from so much of what he said. And I think you'll hear some of the same things in my story. So I grew up in New York, what was referred to as a Bronx Irish Catholic. My father was a policeman. There was alcoholism in my family, but it was all back in Ireland, and people abandoned their families, and it seemed to skip a couple of generations, and it showed up in me. So, I was a blackout drinker and a drunk driver for 17 years. And oddly, I thought of myself as a good kid. If I wasn't really being rebellious against my parents, I wasn't angry. At least I didn't start out angry. But I did have a sense of always had a sense of the rules don't apply to me, and I got gypped. And so that really played in. Once I started drinking, I really sort of moved further and further to the outside. So just to make sure I don't forget to say this, to qualify, my last drink was on December 27th, 1985. And so this December, because of AA, unbelievably, if I can stay sober, I will have 40 years. And I have that applause is from AA. I just followed the suggestion because, believe me, when I got into AA, I did not want to be here. I heard somebody comment that AA is the biggest organization on earth that no one wants to join. But thank God it was there for me, and I'm happy to be here. I hope that my story will help you grasp onto the miracle that is this program. So as I said, I grew up, when I started drinking, I started having blackouts. I thought it was all fun. I actually thought everyone had blackouts. I thought they were a feature. I just thought it made the night more interesting. And I had this friend who was I wasn't really a barfly. I was sort of a periodic drinker, but whenever I drank too much. And one night I was drinking with her in a bar, and I mentioned my blackouts, and she looked at me and she said, "Blackouts are really bad." And she always moved down the bar from me, like she might catch it. And it didn't occur to me that what was happening for me was not happening for everybody else. And, so I had a lot of different kinds of bottoms. One of my bottoms was I had latched onto a really nice guy, and I had decided he should marry me. He was a New York City fireman who ended up, for some reason, doing some work during a blizzard in Buffalo. And I decided I was going to take my VW Bug and drive from Queens, which was where I was living, up to Buffalo in a blizzard, find him and get him to marry me. And so I got into my VW Bug. I got as far as a little town in New York called Sugarloaf, which was like a hippie craft town. And they partied every night, and I stayed with some friends, and we drank and smoked pot. And in the middle of this party, I projectile vomited. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's like everything in your stomach comes out at 90 miles an hour and hits everything in its path. And I just became like a vegetable, and people just sort of draped me over a chair. I don't know where I ended up. And the next morning, I woke up and I said, Pop doesn't agree with me. Never smoke pot again. And then, so I never got to Buffalo. That lucky man escaped my grip. And he didn't deserve me. I'm happy for him. But, at that point, I was still sort of functioning, but there were lots of people telling me that there was something wrong with my drinking. Relatives, bosses, bus boys, bus drivers, cab drivers. One night, a cab driver, dropped me off, and I fell down on the lawn, and he came over and picked me up and walked me to the front door, and he said, "Lady, you shouldn't drink so much." And I just, I was just having a good time. I was just having a good time. And, of course, my family was concerned. And my mom used to say to me, "Jean, just use willpower." As it even says it in the first step, in the 12 to 12, It says something like, self-reliance is of absolutely no use to an alcoholic. In fact, it is a downright liability. And I had to come into these rooms to learn how to give up my willpower and surrender to willingness, which was about letting other people make suggestions so that I could get out of the trap that I had fallen into. And so, the other thing that affected my drinking was I always thought that if I surrounded myself with people that drank more than me, I was okay. They would go down first. And I grew up on Long Island, so we used to go out to Jones Beach, which occasionally would have shark scares. And my father taught me, always make sure when there's a shark scare, make sure there's somebody further out in the water and the shark will get them. And that was my attitude about drinking. As long as I was drinking with people that drank more than me, they would go down first, but they never did. I was the one who, who began to experience real problems, and I was sort of functioning. I had a decent job. I was going to law school at night. I was sort of like a functioning zombie, in fact, even the things I was doing, I was doing all of my life with a sense of desperation because I did not know how to live. And in the summer of 1985, I had been dating a guy from law school, and he broke up with me. And I just tipped into this. I can't stand the way I feel. I know I'm probably an alcoholic. And I began drinking at my life. And I know it was for me, and I think it's for many women, the acceleration of those last 6 months was unbelievable. I was just almost in constant blackouts. I could not control my drinking. It was, I would function all day, and I had a job where I often got taken out to lunch, like business lunches, and I wouldn't function for the rest of the day. I might go to school, and if I was at school, I would run over to the bar in the school, and I would bring back beers to class. I mean, I was just a mess. But in December, at the end of the last couple of months, what began to happen was, I think of now as angels started showing up in my life. And I remember going into St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was near where I worked, and I would sort of kneel in the church and sort of shake my fist at God and say, God, help me to stop drinking. Well, God didn't strike me sober, but God began to send angels pointing me towards AA. And one of them was a law school professor who said he had all he was going to drink in his life and he didn't need it anymore. And another was, I was at a business lecture and the guy said, I go to AA and AA is my medicine. And the third was the night before I came into AA, I was at a friend's house and I was drinking too much. Obviously they wanted me to eat, but I wasn't taking the hint. And she started telling me about someone she knew who drank too much and that their solution was to go to AA. Well, I left her house. I went down to Grand Central Terminal because I lived in Westchester, and I proceeded to drink at the bar in Grand Central Terminal. This past year, I was at I went to one of those documentaries they made about Bill Wilson. And the man in the documentary said that the day after Lois and Bill got evicted from their house, they were sitting in the Grand Central Station on the steps crying because they had no place to go. And here I was on my last night of drinking, about to walk down the stairs, where 50 years before, those two people suffered terribly to set up an organization that was going to set my life straight. The next morning, I was going to go to work. I was going to try and function because as long as I could get to work, I wasn't an alcoholic. And I got to work and I couldn't get a cup of coffee to my lips. And I thought, someday I need to do something about this. And I thought, why not today? And that night I called AA. I went to, and you know what the odd thing was? That wasn't the worst night of my life. It was like the darkness had closed in. I was walking around like a zombie. I couldn't drink enough to make the sun come out. I mean, I literally thought I was going to throw myself onto the train tracks to end it all because I couldn't stand the way I felt. I had had other incidents where I had behaved really badly at a business meeting, one of those meetings where, you know, when you go to work the next day, no one makes eye contact with you. And in fact, I was so embarrassed. I thought I would get sober that night, but I didn't. I thought that would be the end of it. I actually took the dress I had been wearing and I took it down the incinerator of my building and I threw it away because I never wanted to see the dress that might remind me of whatever it was I had done that I couldn't remember. You know, so I was just living in this cloud of shame, in this cloud of darkness. And, you know, so I really believe, you know, when I think about the grace of those angels that showed up in my life, and then sometimes people say, oh, we're the lucky ones. And I think we are lucky in the sense that we have a moment where we open the door. Because I believe grace is chasing us all through our disease, and we simply never open the door. And because there have been other opportunities for me, and I think God wants all of us. He wants every alcoholic to find recovery. But we have to act. We have to have a moment of surrender and willingness. So I went to my first meeting, didn't like it at all. It was, as I said, it was 2 days after Christmas and 3 days before New Year's. That's how desperate I was. I thought, I am not going to live. If I get to New Year's, I'm not going to live through it. And so but then I left the first meeting feeling a little bit of hope. I didn't understand how AA worked. I wish they could have given me a pill and sent me home with a pill, because I had better things to do than go to AA meetings. And, you know, so I just proceeded to act in a lot of self-will. For my first week of being sober, I went to a few more meetings. I went to a meeting on New Year's Eve, and then I left for a ski trip in Vermont with a bunch of people who were drinking. And I lasted about 2 days because I was literally sitting on my hands. I had no skills for not drinking. I had no idea how you go out to dinner with people and not drink. And I was watching the drinks across the table, and I was literally sitting on my hands, pleading with myself not to grab across the table and grab somebody's drink. And I realized after a couple of days, you know what, the funny thing is, I don't even ski. I don't even like to ski. I think skiing is painful and humiliating. So I don't even know why I was there. But anyway, so I got somebody to drive me to a country store where there was a bus that took me back to New York. And someone had that first meeting, gave me a big book. And I read the entire big book on the trip back from Vermont to New York. And I got to tell you, I didn't understand the beginning that had the steps. That didn't sink in at all. I didn't even know the steps were there. But what I understood was the stories in the back, and every story to me was saying, my life was falling apart. I came to AA, my life get better. And those repeated stories of, I got the message. And I came back to AA, and this is the time when people had answering machines. And my answering machine was exploding with all the women who had taken my number at my first couple of meetings saying, where are you, Jean? Come back, come back. So I did go back. I didn't really like it, but I began to hear things that I began to identify with. In fact, at that point, I hadn't even admitted I was an alcoholic. I remember I started going to meetings in Manhattan on my lunch hour. And I remember one day going to a meeting where there was this young girl who was about my age. And I was in my mid-30s at that point, and she was talking about how people counted her drinks. People counted my drinks. And she said, she just kept drinking from larger and larger glasses. And by the time she stopped drinking, she was drinking from a vase. And all I could think of is, why didn't I think of that? You know, so I began to think, you know, maybe I belong here. And then another time, this is also really early on, so I'm just going to tell you a couple of things that became hooks for me, why I kept coming back. This man was leading the meeting, and he was older. He had been duly addicted. I didn't identify with that much about him, but then he said his sponsor had told him that there's only going to be one stop sign in your life, and if you stop going down the road of alcohol, 100 new roads are going to open up to you. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my God, what if he's right? And I have found that largely to be true. And I kept thinking that. I kept thinking, if I can just hang in here, if I can just decide that, okay, I won't drink today, maybe I'll drink tomorrow, but I won't drink today. And let me get a whole bunch of time strung together, not drinking today. And what I've come to understand about what that man said is that I don't get the road that I go onto in AA. It's not my old life minus the alcohol. It is a completely new life, especially if you take the steps seriously. And I'll get to that later. The other thing that I've heard, I went on a business trip to Chicago, and somebody said this amazing thing, which also has become, I didn't understand it, but it stayed with me. And they said, the first 3 steps get you sober, the last 3 steps keep you sober, and the steps in the middle determine the quality of your sobriety. Now, I thought that was important, but did I dive into the steps in the middle? No. I kept my self-will. I needed to have a boyfriend. I needed to be in relationships. I needed to be an alcoholic, a workaholic. Now that I wasn't drinking, I was gonna just work myself because I didn't know how to live life. And I self-willed my life the first bunch of years. I also picked sponsors that wouldn't require much of me, which was important to me at that point. I had one of my sponsors only wanted to talk about inner child issues. It never occurred to me, we were never talking about the steps, we were only talking about our inner children. That should have been a clue. I've gotten much better at picking sponsors now. So anyway, I managed to get myself into a situation where I left my job, went into financial chaos, had a crazy boyfriend who became a stalker. And this is all based on my self-will. This is because I was one of those people that got stuck in the first 3 steps. I was not drinking. I was going to about 3 meetings a week. And I was fine. I was fine. I was doing it my way. I was doing the gene program. And at some point, my life got so chaotic, I actually had the opportunity to relocate to Washington. And when I got to Washington, that was 1993. When I got to Washington, I thought to myself, if I don't get serious about the program, I'm probably going to drink again. And I went to a meeting where I heard a woman who was actually younger than me, but she had more time. And there was something about the way she talked, her spiritual message. I asked her to be my sponsor, and she is still my sponsor today, to this day. We have a long-term relationship. But did I get really serious about changing? Not right away. So I proceeded to get into yet another unhealthy relationship, getting, like this one woman I had heard in my early sobriety made this comment that also stuck with me. And I hear a lot of good things that I don't take the advice of, but she said was, drinks don't come and knock on my door, but people do. And I realized that I kept letting people who were going to drive me to drink into my life. And so I leave this crazy guy in New York, and I go down to DC, and I get into the exact same kind of relationship with another crazy guy. And I realize I am so unhappy. I am having revenge fantasies about getting back at this cheating, whatever. And it began to occur to me that this is not what happens for sober people. Your life doesn't go from one chaotic mess to the next. And I happened to have the good fortune to go away on a retreat where Joe and Charlie were doing the steps, going through the steps. And when they got to step 6, something electric happened to me. One of them read the sentence in the 6th step, which says, "The moment I say no, this I will not change. I close myself off from the grace of God." And I went back to my room and I read those words again. It was like they had never been there in the book before. It was like I did not have the grace or the wisdom to hear what that meant, that I was my own problem. And I literally got on my knees and I started pleading with God to change me, to make me open, exactly the way what Matt was saying before. Make me willing to take the gifts. Make me willing to give up. Make me willing to trust you as my higher power. And so, this went on for I would say at least a month, I was in this struggle with my will. And at one point, I left the West Side Club. The West Side Club has a great meeting called, it used to be called the Bagel Meeting on Sunday mornings. And I walked down Wisconsin Avenue. And I was standing across from a famous bar called Martin's. And I was standing literally on a street corner, looking up to heaven and saying, "Dear God, I'm still in so much self-will and so much pain. Would you please change me?" And it felt like that was the moment at which my life began to change. I went down to meet a group of people from AA who were having a brunch at a restaurant. And I met the man who was going to be my husband at that brunch. And it was like within 6 months, I was engaged. I was in the first healthy relationship I'd been in like 20 years. And he was like an incredibly beautiful spiritual person. He had about 10 years more sobriety than I had. And so we got married, and like this whole new beautiful chapter in my sobriety, like all my dreams came true. We ended up adopting children. And I was 45 years old when I got married. I was 50 when I adopted my first child. All the things that everybody thought, you're too old, it'll never happen. Well, all these miracles came into my life. And I remember sitting in a park, watching my kids playing on the swings, and just saying, "Dear God, thank you so much. Thank you that I got sober. Thank you that I got to have this beautiful joy." But I had a sense, I really did have a sense that life changes. And, I don't have any guarantee that this beautiful life is going to continue forever. And that is in fact what happened. Like our life went into a train trip. Like it was like a train in our lives. My husband, as I said, was older than me. And when my kids were in middle school, he was diagnosed with dementia. And it just blew our lives apart. And he ended up having to go into a nursing home. Both of my kids had special needs. I had to work full time. And, my reaction was not, I had seen enough people in AA go through crises where I knew the reaction wasn't to shake my fist at God and say, "Why me?" My reaction was to say, "What's next? Okay, God, give me the strength." And you know what I did? I took out my calendar. I was never one for going to new meetings. And I figured out I had to schedule a meeting for myself every single day, because there was no way I was going to get through what was coming my way that I didn't understand. There were so many uncertainties in my life. I didn't know how I was going to get through them. And so I just instead of using this tragedy as an excuse to turn my back on AA and say, "I'm too busy, I have too many problems," I turned into AA, because that's what I had seen other people do. No matter what the tragedy, whether it's an illness, the loss of a child, the loss of a marriage, whatever it is, there's nothing I can't make worse by picking up a drink. So my husband ended up passing away. In fact, it'll be 9 years tomorrow. He passed away in 2016. And after he died, it occurred to me, because when we first got married, we used to spend every morning reading together from spiritual books, and we had a very disciplined spiritual life, and that lasted until I had kids. And for any mothers with young kids in this room, I totally empathize. It's really, really hard to balance everything. And the thing that for many years sort of went out the window was the spiritual life. And I really, my kids were older by this time. I could take the time in the morning. I needed to take the time in the morning. And I began this beautiful spiritual journey in 2016. As the result of his passing away, I doubled down on step 11. And I began sharing an 11-step meeting in Old Town Alexandria. And I pulled into, my program has continued to evolve. I have gotten very much into service. I sponsor several, actually, right now, quite a few women. One of the things that this came up for me to share because of that share of "I'm not ready." I had a little bit of a miracle last week. Over the course of the pandemic, I started going to a morning meeting, which I still go to. It's out of the West Side Public, 7 a.m. in the morning. And over the course of the pandemic, this young woman kept showing up in the meeting, often drunk, often saying, I have 3 hours, I have 2 hours, I have 1 day. And it was painful to watch. And she would disappear for a while, and then she'd come back and she'd say, I went out. Well, I decided to start praying for this young woman. And about a week ago, she showed up at the Zoom meeting, and I stayed after the meeting and said to her, she lives on the other side of the county, and I took her number and I said, I said, I will come over, I'll take you to this other club, I'll help you find a sponsor. So I was down here in Delaware, and I was going back to Alexandria that night. I went to my regular 11-step meeting in Alexandria, and I walk in, and this woman from the Zoom meeting that I'd never seen in person before, I know it's her because I've seen her face 1,000 times. She sits down across from me, and so I told her who I was. So we got together, and she asked me to be her sponsor. And my honest to God reaction was, I thought, I'm not ready for this. This woman has so many problems. She doesn't live near me. How am I going to do this? But it was sort of like exactly what Matt said before, is like you show up and God teaches you through the lessons he puts into your life. So, I just, it's sort of humbling for me to sort of accept the fact that, I have something to offer this woman. I hope, I pray that I have the right things to help her with her program, because in lots of ways, our journeys are very different. I have never had a problem with drugs. And the one thing I will say this beautiful young woman has going for her is that she always tells the truth. And that's one of the things I've noticed with women I've tried to sponsor. Women that are ashamed of the fact that they have a slip and pretend that they have time they don't have, that is deadly. That is really the worst thing you can do, is to pretend you are sober when you're not. And the one thing I think this young woman, and I had a conversation with about her the other day, and I said, I have noticed you have never lied about your sobriety. You've always come back and said, I have 1 day, I have 2 hours. And she's, yeah, I don't lie. I don't want to lie. And I think that is a really important factor, because when I came into AA, I had a very tenuous relationship with the truth. I didn't think it was, I thought, especially being Irish, I thought it was actually stretching the truth was like making a story better, it's like, well, why stick with the truth when, exaggeration can be so much more fun. So, I have to say that, today, I have learned self-honesty. I've learned the value of humility. I have learned the value of pause. I don't have to show up for every fight that I'm invited to. I just want to close with that. I think you've probably all heard this story, but it really moves me. And it's the story, I actually first heard it on does anybody remember the show, The West Wing? It was a character in The West Wing named Leo McGarry, who's a recovering alcoholic. And that was the first place I heard this story. And it's about guys walking down the street and falls into a hole. And he calls out, somebody come help me. And a priest comes by, and he throws down into the hole. He throws a prayer. And then a doctor comes by, and the guy screams, come help me, I can't get out of the hole. And the doctor throws down a prescription. And then an alcoholic walks by. And the guy goes, help me. And the alcoholic jumps into the hole with them. And he goes, are you crazy? Now we're both stuck. And he says, no, we're not. I've been in this hole and I know the way out. And that is what we do every time we show up in an AA meeting. We show up to show the newcomer the way out of the damn hole that deprives us of our lives, deprives us of peace of mind, deprives us of self-esteem, deprives us of happiness and real connections with other people. And I just want to say the last thing, this is really the last thing I'm going to say. I think of AA as sort of being like a bait and switch scheme. I came into AA because I wanted to stop drinking and I wanted to stop vomiting and having hangovers and making a fool out of myself. And by surrendering to the steps, I have gotten a completely new way of living. I have a completely new life. And in fact, sometimes I think I've had a brain transplant. I am not the person who came in here. And it's all because of you. So if you can stick around, as it says in the literature, you can join us on the road of happy destiny. So thanks for letting me share.